Welcome to Tales from SYL Ranch, where everyone is entitled to my opinion. And I'm Bill Stone. Well, I've got your attention. I'd like to ask that if you like what I'm doing, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell, share me on social media, and tell all of your friends, family, neighbors, pets, and livestock to do the same. Following me and sharing my videos on social media is very important for me because I am a one-man shop with absolutely no money for advertising, and so social media is the way that I grow. So please follow me on Twitter at SYLTales and every other social media known to man. I'm on more than you'd imagine. You can see them on the About page for this channel. And I would appreciate your support. There is a page on my website that is linked to in my description box. Please feel free to go there and give me stuff. So, looks like we got nobody right at the moment, but that's okay. We'll just go ahead and wait, and while I do that, I'll kill some time explaining my show. Tales from SYL Ranch is a science fiction, fantasy, horror, superhero, and other genre-related review show. Sometimes I review serious films and TV. Sometimes I review schlock. And sometimes I review stuff with broad appeal, like Star Wars movies, Marvel movies, The Orville, Doctor Who, and lately Batwoman, although that sucker's just become the modern Plan 9 from outer space. It's so dumb. I no longer watch or review Star Trek because Star Trek is no longer Star Trek, and I talk about this in my video of the same name, and there's a link to that in my description box as well. For classic films and TV, like the one that I'm going to review tonight, I usually stay with the period of about 1900 to 1980. And that's because the period after that is pretty well documented. It's kind of the modern age of science fiction, and it's pretty well documented. But 1900 to 1980 also contains a lot of science fiction and a lot of science fiction fandom that isn't very well documented. And so part of the reason I do the show is to document it. Most of the time, my reviews are pre-recorded, but for special events such as this, where I have reached 200 subscribers, which is a milestone for me, and the fact that I'm reviewing a kind of unusual movie, I will do a live stream like I am now. And because of that, and because of the fact that I don't have a ton of viewers, I will take any and all questions, comments, and nasty remarks. I will do my best to respond to everyone. And you can tell me if I missed something, if I'm completely full of crap, or if I just happen to be an amazingly hoopy fruit. I go into a lot more depth than any other reviewer. I don't just talk about the plot and whether I liked it or not. I go into the acting, the direction, the cinematography, and all of the mechanics of making a film. And I can do this because a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I was once an actor. So I can speak with a modicum of authority. Not as much authority as a modern working actor, but with some authority. There's an old saying, those who can do, and those who can't teach. And I suppose that doing reviews is sort of like teaching. One thing I don't do is outrage reviews. There are a lot of reviewers on YouTube who are simply portraying outrage because they discovered after The Last Jedi that outrage sells. They knee-jerk hate everything because their viewers just want to see them hate things. But this has a weird feedback loop between fans and popular reviewers, and it winds up ultimately where nobody can like anything, even if it's good. So I don't do that. If I like something, I will tell you why in detail. If I dislike it, I will tell you why in detail. But I don't do outrage. Unlike other reviewers, I am the adult in the room. So a little non-spoiler stuff on this, because this Son of Ingagi is a really weird movie on a number of levels. The first off, the name of this film is a complete bait and switch if you know the history about it. The film is from a short story called The House of Horror, which is written by the film's screenwriter, and he's also an actor in this, Spencer Williams. Spencer Williams later went on to have a lot of fame as one half of the comedy duo Amos and Andy in the 1950s, something that is, in retrospect, looked at as maybe something that is a little bit racist. But at the time, when did you see a TV show starring two black people? You know, in 1950s, early 1950s, that just didn't happen. So this is 1940. He later did go on to do some, pretty amazing stuff, whether you think it's good or bad now or not. But if you're not familiar with this, the reason that Ingagi appears in this title, because if you've watched this, there is no Ingagi. There's no Ingagi at all. So if you've watched it, you may wonder, why is there an Ingagi in this title? Well, it's kind of weird. The film, called Ingagi, The reason that we have Son of Ingagi in here, hey, Super Crew 63, good evening to you as well. The reason that we have Son of Ingagi in this is because of a 1930 film called Ingagi. And now the two are really totally unrelated, but Ingagi was supposedly a documentary in which an expedition entered an area of the Congo jungle to report on a gorilla-worshipping tribe. And after long and dangerous adventures, they come upon the tribe that they'd sought only to watch as a virgin is sacrificed to a huge gorilla and who takes her hostage and away. And the expedition then supposedly goes on to follow this gorilla in an attempt to save the woman, right? It's this weird sort of early found footage fake documentary, because the weirdest part about this, the whole bizarre part about this movie Ingagi, which has nothing to do with Son of Ingagi except for the name, the weird part about Ingagi was the gorilla took this virgin and had sex with her. Yep. Just out and out, had sex with her. This film, 1930, that would have been pre-code in Hollywood. That meant that really you could do almost anything. They could make almost anything they wanted without any impunity. The movie code came along much later and stopped them from doing movies about just about anything. That was precursor to the modern, rating system that we have for films today. So. But yes, the gorilla and the woman have sex. Now, the film was later discovered to have not been a documentary at all, but rather a film that was shot with black actors. Any of the documentary footage that was in it was actually animals that were shot at a local zoo, or pilfered. They pilfered the footage out of real documentaries. Obviously, this Congo tribe never existed. It never sacrificed women to gorillas for their sexual gratification. It was just stupid entire way. But it was a popular movie. But the entire thing was really no more than a cheap exploitation film designed to portray black people as complete and utter savages. But after the film's nature was actually revealed, it was thought for decades that it was just completely lost forever. Totally lost. We would never see it again. Obviously, nobody was ever going to re-release that film, particularly in modern times. And it was assumed that just the prints were probably destroyed forever. However, it turns out that the Library of Congress actually has Ingagi on its files. However, due to its nature, it is far from the top of the Library of Congress's lists to get cleaned up and released. One hopes that they have it done in such a fashion that it actually isn't, the prints aren't destroyed, but, again, not on their top of list of things to put out. So the reason that the film I'm reviewing tonight, The Son of Ingagi, was called that was to capitalize on Ingagi's popularity. It sort of implies that the monster in this film is the offspring maybe of a gorilla and a Congo tribeswoman. That's kind of what they were going for with the title. It isn't really The Son of Ingagi, but it's sort of intended to take advantage of that. So, with that out of the way, we do come to the review itself. Do feel free to hop right in and ask me questions. I know a little bit more about this than you'd imagine by virtue of having researched this film. We will have to take it as read that if you've come to this video looking for a review, you've either already watched Son of Ingagi or you just don't care if it's been spoiled. But just for safety's sake, we should probably issue a...
Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert! All hands, prepare for incoming spoilers.
Yes, it is a spoiler alert, and that is because I am a Fandi Master, and that means that the fandom is strong with me, and that means that nothing is new. Unfortunately, this isn't a boast or a brag. This is just where you find yourself after having watched, read, and listened to over 100 years' worth of science fiction. You just can't see the new stuff for the century that came before. You find out that just isn't that much that's original, and it sometimes interferes with your ability to enjoy things. But I have to tell you, not so much with this one. This film is generally rather unenjoyable for anyone at all. So, let me drop something down here because I realize that I have failed to put my cards where I was supposed to have them. There, yeah. So, the plot of this film, if you have not seen it, it is on YouTube. I forgot to put a link to it in the description box, but I will. There are 3 different copies of it on YouTube. Watch the one that is 1 hour, that is only 1 hour and 2 minutes long. The one that's 1 hour and 20 minutes actually just has nothing but about 20 minutes worth of black at the end. There's no point. You watched it last night, and it was not shot very well. Oh, you're damn right about that. Yeah, this is a low-budget film in every way, and it really does show. So the plot of this is, the film opens at Bob and Eleanor Lindsay's wedding, and among the guests is Dr. Helen Jackson, something of an irritable sort of recluse. But after the wedding ends, the friends of the bride and the groom surprise them with a party at wherever they are, at which the Real World Four Toppers, which was a real-world singing quartet, provide musical entertainment. Dr. Jackson then meets with her attorney, Bradshaw, and changes her will to leave her estate to the newlywed couple. Meanwhile, there is an explosion at the local foundry where Bob Lindsay works. The partygoers and Bob all leave to investigate, leaving Eleanor at home alone, and she's then visited by Dr. Jackson, who has been creeping outside their window. Who explains that she was once in love with Eleanor's father and that she'd fled to Africa on a missionary mission later after he married Eleanor's mother. But Dr. Jackson then returns home and is approached by her brother Zeno, who has broken into her home by crawling through the window. And Zeno insists that on Jackson's trips to Africa she must have taken gold and hidden it in her office. But in response to this, Dr. Jackson hits a gong, which calls upon the monster Nagina. Again, nothing, no name, it's not in Ingagi, it's in Nagina, who she has taken from her previous trips to Africa, and Jackson's brother then flees out the window, terrified. Bob returns home and announces that the foundry has been destroyed. Consequently, he no longer has a job. But later, in her laboratory that same night, this whole thing takes place over maybe a couple of days, Jackson is working on a serum that she believes is the greatest contribution that mankind has ever been discovered by a doctor. So Nagina then takes the serum, drinks it, and causes him to go on a rampage, and he kills Dr. Jackson. Nagina is this sort of half-ape, half-human. Again, we're kind of slightly pushing the notion that Nagina is the son of an ape and a human. So the Lindsays then discover that they are the beneficiary of Helen's will, and due to her sudden death, they are initially suspected of murdering her, but later they are acquitted of the crime, and they move into Helen's manor, which is supposed to be quite a lot bigger than it actually is. Eleanor soon discovers that food is disappearing mysteriously. Bradshaw, the attorney, he and the executor of the will, comes to urge them to sell the house. And while looking through papers in Dr. Jackson's desk, he finds this gong thing and hits the gong. Well, this summons Nagina from his hiding place in the cellar, and Nagina kills Bradshaw. And then we have Detective Nelson, and he's assigned to solve the mystery of the house and moves into the home. It turns out he only has to be there one night. I think it's implied that maybe he's going to be there longer, but it's really just one night. Zeno then breaks into the couple's bedroom during the night, but escapes because Eleanor accidentally hits Bob rather than Zeno. I don't mean with a gun or anything, she just physically hits him. And after seeing Nagina emerge from the basement, Zeno follows Nagina's path and finds Helen's gold in Nagina's sort of bed cell thingy. It's like looking at some kind of a zoo thing. It's not really locked, though. It's not locked. Nagina has complete run of the house, but it looks like a cage. But Nagina finds Zeno, kills him, and drags Zeno's body upstairs, which Detective Nelson then finds. Eleanor spots Nagina and faints at the sight of him, and the Nagina then carries Eleanor downstairs, and when Nelson finds Zeno's body, he awakens Bob, who then starts searching for Eleanor. Nagina accidentally starts a fire in the basement, and as Eleanor's screams draw Bob and Nelson into the basement, where Nelson then tries to arrest Nagina? Okay. But Bob, however, succeeds in locking the beast in the cell and then carries Eleanor outside while the house burns. And apparently Nagina and Nelson are inside. However, Nelson emerges from the bushes, having escaped inexplicably from the fire, and he presents Bob and Eleanor with 2 bags of gold, which were found while he was grappling with Nagina. And fade out, the end. That's the whole plot. Now, really, the only great moment that I would say about this, because I always like to say something good about a film or a TV show, even if it's dumb, and this one kind of is, but there is a great moment here because it was how black people are treated and portrayed. You know, this was an era in which mainstream films only cast black people in roles like really stereotypical ones like servants or mammies who barely spoke rational English. But here we're treated to a black female doctor, a black detective, a black chief of police, a black attorney, and an extremely typical married couple of that era who are black. It really does, it can't be emphasized enough how unusual this was. I mean, one of the more famous black characters of that era was Sam, the piano player in 1942's, 2 years later, Casablanca. And he was as close as an equal to Humphrey Bogart's Rick Blaine. They were friends, clearly. But he was as close as any black character could. But, even in that film, he was called Boy by anyone who doesn't know his name. Here the word boy is really only used in the literal sense or as a catch-all term for a male black person who's younger, as opposed to the word boy, which I remember being used to describe a black guy into the early 1970s. It became very, very racist, and they hated it about the 1970s. But for that long a period of time, you could call a black man boy and get away with it. But aside from the way black people are portrayed, the film is generally a lot of cringe moments. You have to remember that a film like this would have been aimed at an all-black audience, something that Hollywood didn't consider important. And while there were other black, films with black casts, they were, all very low budget, again, just because Hollywood didn't consider black people that important. When you made a film for, an African-American audience, it was called a race film. I guess there's only one race out there, but it was called a race film. And they were low budget, not a lot of them made. This is one of the few, and it is the first African-American horror film. But I do have cringe moments. Oh, man. My biggest cringe moment is that while the plot sounds like it would be enough to carry a film, it is actually extremely slow-paced. While it's only an hour long, those minutes just drag by endlessly. And as I mentioned, this is an extremely low-budget film, and it is readily apparent from almost every aspect of it. It has shot as Super Cruise 63. It was not shot well. It was shot very statically, only occasionally using close-ups to sort of punctuate the horror, but not very much. Had it been directed a little more creatively, it could have been more menacing than it was, but since this was such a low-budget film, they probably had to shoot very quickly, and, there wasn't a lot of time to be very creative. The monster is similarly very low budget, which is little more than a sort of hairy semi-gorilla suit. I think they do a reasonable job with the lower part of the face. Everything else is pretty bad. But again, it's sort of giving you this opinion that it's the son of an ape and a human female. So, Detective Nelson is portrayed in the film by the writer Spencer Williams, and again, he went on to more success than any of the other actors or anybody else, frankly, in this film. And he's played virtually incompetent. He's just played for the laughs, not noticing at one point that the monster is directly behind him on numerous occasions, actually. There's a particularly cringe-worthy sequence showing Nelson preparing sandwiches for himself with Nagina stealing them right behind him, and he just walks up behind him and he's not looking and steals all these sandwiches. Totally, completely undercuts any tension that may have been built about Nagina and any horror. Super Crew 63 says the best part was when Nelson was making sandwiches and they kept disappearing. Yeah, I mean, it's a funny bit. It's just like this is supposed to be a horror movie, and the stuff about it that's any good really isn't the horror part. It more undercuts the horror part than anything else. So, but yeah, if you were going to find a good part, that probably be it. You can see he did later on, as I say, go on to do Amos and Andy. And that was a comedy, so you can see where his comedic sense is coming into play here. So, speaking of Spencer Williams, spoke about him a bit. Again, let me move this down. I want to be able to see my hands. So, okay. Spencer Williams lived from 1893. I'm going to have to watch myself because most of these actors were born in the 1800s. Some of them, way back into what we consider like Wild West era. But he was born in 1893, died in 1969 at the age of 76. He was an American actor, writer, director, and producer, and his early pioneering work in African-American films, such as this one, was then later totally eclipsed by his fame in Amos and Andy. And again, that show at the time was not considered anything like, it was just two black guys, and they were a little stereotypical. I've seen episodes of it. They're a little stereotypical, but they're just comic. Just doing comedy. It's not anything that's like really nasty out there about being really racist. And again, his comedic ability, no doubt, is the reason that Detective Nelson, whom he plays, is generally sort of a bumbling fool in this entire movie. Williams' IMDb goes from 1928 to 1959 with 33 actor credits. He's got the most actor credits among anybody, and one of those credits then also translates into 78 episodes of Amos and Andy that ran from 1951 to 1955. Pretty good run, 4 years on TV, which at that time was pretty good. He also has 13 director credits, 8 writer credits, and 1 producer credit, and has won no awards. In terms of his writing, well, I always talk about the writing first, because if you ain't got a script, then you ain't got nothing to shoot. And so anything good or bad dramatically is ultimately the fault of the writer. Super Crew 63, and when Nelson woke up to the body and yelled, "Somebody called the police," laughed my butt off. He was the police. Yeah, what real good there is to come out of this really comes out of his comedic timing, his sense of comedy. The issue is, however, that it's a horror movie. So it's supposed to, you could have made this if you had a little bit of bigger budget, and if you had better direction, you could have done this and made it into a very poor man's, sort of Frankenstein. But, again, they didn't have that big a budget. I think sometimes they needed to put filler in, and it was natural with Williams to try to do it with comedy, and we'll also see it with the musical numbers in a minute. So, as I say, I always talk about the script first. The film is based on Williams' short story, House of Horror. I have been unable to find a copy of this, though I'd be very, very interested to see what it's read it and see how much it, matches or not. To be honest, however, knowing that it was based on a short story makes some level of sense. The film is only about an hour long, but with tighter editing, it could easily have only run half an hour. It's boring. I mean, it's really, really boring. It is so much going very, very slowly. If it was paced anything like, the horror movies of the time, modern horror movies, like I say, it could be half an hour. But in addition, Spencer Williams obviously had a great comedic sense. As I mentioned, he went on to do Amos and Andy. And it is probably some of the best stuff in the film, even though it's a horror film. But, occasionally, it's funny, but it's kind of out of place. But if you took it out, this film would be half an hour long. And you can't do that. You got to have something longer. It isn't even 90 minutes. It is literally 1 hour, 2 seconds long, 62 minutes. If you take out this stuff, you're not going to have a movie left. And being as he was a comedy guy, I can see him going for that. In terms of his acting, Well, again, he plays a bumbling detective, and if you're at all familiar with his comedy, as I am, he definitely uses it to his advantage. It's just that it is a little out of place in a horror movie. If you cut this into like two movies, one with him being comedic and one where they actually have horror, it'd be a different sort of animal. One would wonders what the film would have been like, in fact, if Nelson were played a little more straight rather than for laughs. But again, it'd be such a short movie. And Williams' performance is fine. It's just, again, his comedy is great. His comedy, as Super 63 says, is very funny. It's just, you wonder, what did this look like in a short story? Because I can't imagine that he put that kind of comedy in there. It's a lot of physical comedy. So you can't translate physical comedy into a short story very easily. I suspect it was more just a straight horror film, but there was no way, they couldn't figure out a way to pad that out without doing a couple of other things, and the comedy was one of it. Sometimes, when I do older reviews, I play 6 Degrees of Star Trek, but it turns out no one in this film knows anyone or had anything to do with anyone who was in Star Trek. It was too early in the era, and, black people didn't get a lot of roles. Even the actors that I'm going to talk about, with the exception of Spencer Williams. The actors that I'm going to talk about, even if they worked very much, they didn't work enough so that they were probably making the bills pay. It's just the way it was. So then we have Laura Bauman as Dr. Helen Jackson, rather. She lived 1881 to 1957, passing away at the age of 76. As I say, some of these people go back to like the 1880s. You have to imagine what these people saw. I mean, they went from the horse being a primary mode of transportation to into 1957 with nuclear power, satellites, and, vehicles that ran at 80 miles an hour. It's a very interesting life that you would have lived with that. She was active in films from 1920 to 1946 with 11 acting credits, all but one of which is for feature films, and the other is for a short. And Son of Ingagi was her next to last role, and she never won any awards. In her performance, well, the character is one of two, with the other one being Detective Nelson, who's written with anything more than just a single dimension. There's a lot of one- and two-dimensional characters in here. She's at first very completely unlikable. At the very opening of the film, very unlikable because she's a misanthrope and, isn't very nice to a lot of people. But then she has this really nice scene. It's really the only really nice human kind of scene with Eleanor Lindsay, where she becomes a much warmer and relatable person, and the audience starts to, feel good about her. Bauman says, does this, she plays this really quite well, such that when she's killed by Nagino, you really do find, you're like, oh, that's too bad, it was a good person. And the way that she's, again, it's a question of how they were treating these characters. She is a medical doctor who has been working on something, and we don't hear what it is, unfortunately, but she's been working on something that she thinks is going to be the greatest gift to mankind medically that has ever happened. You just start to wonder, what is it? But you believe that she's doing that. You didn't see black medical doctors who were about to make that kind of contribution to science. That's really quite amazing. But Bobin does a great job with what she's given. It's just she actually doesn't have that much screen time. If you look at it, to be honest, nobody has that much screen time, but she doesn't have that much, but she does a good job. Then there is Alfred Grant as Robert Lindsay. He lived 1912 to 1984, dying at the age of 72. IMDb lists him as active from 1938 to 1957 with 14 acting credits, almost all of which had character names. Now, again, this was a period in time where they mostly were casting black actors as servants, nannies, people. Yes, master. Yeah, yes, sir. I go and do that, sir. Yes, sir. Very, very stereotypical. So if you've got a character who has a name listed, as opposed to like back then, fourth Negro, which is what they were calling people then if they were going to be nice about them. They would call them specifically by their race, which was Negro at that time, not black and not African American, nothing. Negro was the preferred term up until the early to mid 1970s. Hey, Larry, how are you doing? And Super Crew 63. Sorry about my glasses. I may get to a point where I'm going to have to wear my glasses all the time. My scripts, I have to kick how big the text is way, way up now from where I did a year ago, and I can't read the comment box next to it at all. Super Crew 63. Yeah, that's what that. Okay, yeah. So, yes, hi, Larry. Again, I can't read it anymore, so I wasn't sure if Super Crew 63 had posted something new. But again, with Alfred Grant, he does have a lot of character names in his IMDb, which is a good sign. You know, it's not third Negro from the left. Character names matter when you get something like this. He won no awards. Now, as with all of the characters except Dr. Nelson and Dr. Jackson and Detective Nelson, the character that he plays is rather two-dimensional. He is a typically heroic male who saves the girl in the end, and his performance is generally unremarkable. I believe it. I buy him throughout, but, you know, he doesn't have a lot to play with here. He is credited in various places as one of Hollywood's examples of a typical leading man at a time when, you know, black people were usually playing servants or even slaves. And he's definitely a leading man here, and he comes off as a leading man, despite his skin color. But, you know, he's not particularly remarkable as a leading man. And one tends to wonder what he might have done with better material. There are lots of there's 14 other movies out there, 13 other ones, where he plays other things, and there may be one where he's got a really decent role. I might be interested to see that. Yep, it was a short film, Larry says, 1 hour. Yeah, and really, really, really slow-paced. What was the sci-fi element? Well, the sci-fi element was just that... I mean, I do horror as well, but if there's a sci-fi element in this at all, it's just Dr. Jackson. Sort of. You know, she's a doctor who is doing research and keeping Nagina, and, you know, that was about it. I guess you could say maybe there's another sci-fi action element. I spoke at the beginning of this episode, of this review, and you missed it, Larry. But the reason that this thing is called Son of Ingina, despite the fact that there is no character name Ingina or anything like that, is because there was a very bad exploitation film in 1930, 10 years before this, that was reasonably popular at theaters, that purported to be a documentary where they went to Africa and they found this tribe that turns virgins over to an ape that they call Ingina, or Ingagi, and the ape has sex with the woman. And it was not a documentary. It was found out to be complete fraud later. But Son of Ingagi is sort of telling you that, oh, okay, maybe this ape thing that we're seeing here is actually the offspring of a human and a gorilla. So maybe there's a little bit of sci-fi in that too. Who knows? Then we have Daisy Buford as Eleanor Lindsay. She lived 1913 to 1987, dying at the age of 74. She was active in films from 1922 to 1944, with 29 acting credits, all of which were films, and she has the third longest IMDb of anybody in the cast. Superguru 63 says, thank goodness it was only an hour long. If it wasn't for Nelson and the Four Toppers, it would have been a worse fail. Yeah. The only thing really that is notable about this film is how they treated the African-American characters. You know, it was just a time period where if you were black, I mean, you know, at best you were going to get hired doing, you know, slave roles or roles where you were somebody's servant. It was yes, I do that, sir, and I'm not even being over the top about that. That yes, sir, that's the way they do it. They be doing this kind of role. That's all they be doing. So to see somebody with African Americans doing real human things and being treated as real human beings is pretty unusual. The fact that this is billed out as a horror movie and the first African American one, yeah, it is, but it's also slower than Molasses in January. And as you say, if it wasn't for Nelson and the Four Toppers, it would have been even shorter, and it wouldn't have been nearly as good, probably. But with Daisy Buford's performance, as with all the other characters except Dr. Jackson and Detective Nelson, she's pretty two-dimensional. She's a typical newlywed, typical wife, and typical woman who must be saved from the monster by the leading man. At that, not so much to be seen there as a character. There he already says all the characters were very articulate. Yeah, and that's how black people were then and still are now. They can be very articulate. It's just that films of that period always had, people, yes, I go and do that for you, sir. All right, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I'll take care of that. I don't know nothing about birthing no babies, but believe me, in real life, those people were just as articulate as every white person around them. And yes, she was very pretty. Absolutely, she was very pretty. And bringing that to this role was actually a really good thing because, again, it was sort of two-dimensional. But there is that scene at the beginning with Dr. Jackson that really does stick out. And it is partly Buford's performance. But it's also how that performance and how those two characters are interacting alters the audience's perception of Dr. Jackson because she, started out as a real kind of misanthrope, spendthrift who was not giving, she offers to pay the attorney $5 to change her will. $5 back then, if you multiply it by about, 100 or so, yeah, that was okay. But, it wasn't a ton of money. And then he asks, hey, we had to have a couple of witnesses for this. Maybe we should pay them too. And she's like, no, I'm giving you $5 and that's all. You pay them out of your own pocket or whatever. But yes, they were definitely very articulate comparatively. And she brings a lot to that one scene. And by being this sort of smiling, upbeat newlywed, that says that she invited this misanthrope, Dr. Jackson, to her wedding for purely human reasons, it gave Jackson, that actress, a chance to kind of, soften and become a lot more sympathetic to the audience. And without that scene, we wouldn't have cared at all if she was killed off. It'd be like, well, good riddance. She's a complete bitch, So as this kind of, two-dimensional woman that Buford plays, you still have to wonder. I wonder how she would be if she was, given better material. And she does have a lot of other movies out there, so it might be able to find out. I just didn't have time of the day to do it. Yep, I never saw The Hidden Gold. Yeah, nobody ever figured that out except for one of the antagonists, but he's dead anyway, so he dies in the fire where Nelson somehow, inexplicably, makes his way out of this fire. Who knows? Speaking of the lawyer Bradshaw, that's played by Earl Morris, you'll notice that a lot of these things where I'm getting pictures of the actor are just screen caps out of the movie because they didn't, it was a totally different era. A lot of stuff, like even if they had 8x10 headshots, they don't survive. You're talking about actors who were working in pretty often exclusively in these what they call race films, which were films aimed at African Americans. So there aren't a lot of pictures of them out there. Some of them I have no pictures whatsoever for. But if they're in the film, I was at least able to get a screen cap of them. Not the most flattering thing, but it's about the best screen cap I could find. So Earl Morris, playing Bradshaw, he was born in 1897. And this is, again, a problem when you get into black actors in this time period. A lot of what they are and who they are doesn't survive. So we don't know when he died. It's just 1897. No doubt he's passed away long ago by now. But he was in this film and born then. His IMDb lists him as active from 1939 to 1942 with 5 actor credits, only 2 of which have names. And again, when you're doing this kind of role, if you're a black person back then, having a name in the credits was important. That meant you were not third Negro from the left. You weren't, or worse, third spear chucker from the left, which, you get into movies like Tarzan, that's what you got. Black cinema was a completely separate category back then, yes. And as this movie clearly shows, oftentimes generally made on a very, very shoestring budget, which contributes to it not being a very good horror film, as well as it being very, very, very slow. Oh, it's really slow-paced. Anyway, he worked on several other films with Spencer Williams, the writer and actor who played Nelson in this, and won no awards. None of them won any awards. How can you win an award when this is one of the best roles that you're going to get? You're on screen for 10 minutes and you do a reasonably decent job, and then you're killed off by a monster. What do you do? He's a little wooden sometimes, a little forced. He's not terrible. I generally believe him, although there are moments where you kind of go, this is a little bit forced. He does a decent job of playing a black attorney. Again, a black attorney. Back then, the only place that you were going to see black people looking anything like equal to whites was in this kind of race film. So he's a black attorney, and he plays it. He's likable, he's congenial, but again, kind of one-dimensional. And again, one wonders how he would have done with better material. And he does have, 5 other credits out there. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, but one does wonder if he'd do better. Then we have Arthur Ray as Zeno Jackson, the slimebag brother of Dr. Jackson. He, again, another guy, born 1888, died 1942 at the age of 74, 74 rather. He was active in films 1921 to 1942 with 14 actor credits, most of whom had names. Again, that's important when you're getting into these because it means that he was not working as third Negro from the left, No awards like anybody else. And as with the others, his character is a little two-dimensional. It alternates between being a very slimy little weasel trying to get his sister's gold to being a complete coward and somebody who is killed by Nagina, and hey, nobody was really upset about that. He was a slimy little weasel. He plays this really quite well. I totally believe his attempting to blackmail and then steal the gold from Dr. Jackson, and then being a complete coward and fleeing whenever possible, and then finally being killed when not. I totally buy this guy. I find his performance, generally kind of better than some of the other actors, and kind of be interested in seeing what he would do with different material, just for comparison. Then we have Zach Williams as Nagina. Again, let me move my poster down to the right spot. I couldn't find any pictures of him. I couldn't find any pictures of him whatsoever, which is why I just go back and default to the picture of the thing. He was born in 1884. Again, somebody who lived in what we would think of as the Wild West. And he died in 1958 at the age of 74. His IMDb lists him as active from 1920 to 1948 with 27 actor credits, believe it or not. He's the second number of credits in the cast, and he played Elijah in Gone with the Wind. So this is his only major motion picture role. It's the only major motion picture role that any of these actors have. Now, I have not seen... I have not watched Gone with the Wind closely enough to know whom this character is. The fact that he was named is probably a good sign, but on the other hand, you're talking about a movie in the South in the Civil War. He's probably some kind of slave or, a servant of some kind. But he did get to do a major motion picture, and nobody else did. So he plays this Nagina. He's a hulking brute in a semi-gorilla costume. He menaces fine, although the execution is totally hampered by both the direction and the makeup, if you can call it that. The best thing about it is the lower part of the face. The rest of it, just looks like a big, shaggy, hairy thing. It's not that great. I'll talk about it when I get into the makeup. He probably would have been better in a better film, and the fact that he had a fair amount of credits and was in Gone with the Wind, that probably tells you something about how good he was. But here he's just, getting enraged at one point, killing people, just not, what do you do with that, right? Makeup is different. Yeah, it's pretty cheap, but it was a low-budget film. What do you expect? And then we have our Four Toppers, the Four Toppers. These guys were a real musical group, a quartet, who provided music for several films and recorded a number of single records. I think I found 10 songs that they recorded. The members of the Four Toppers were Jimmy Springs, who was first tenor, Dave Patillo, who was second tenor, Richard Davies, who was baritone and played the bass fiddle, and Steve Gibson, who was the bass singer and on guitar. We see all of them here. He drank the formula, but nothing changed him. Yeah, well, aside from him becoming enraged after drinking it, whatever that amazing thing was that Dr. Jackson was working on apparently didn't work on half human, half gorillas. Again, that the Ingagi film influenced the title of this one. And the inference is that we're dealing with a son of the woman and the ape in that first crappy, total exploitation Ingagi film. So, yeah. IMDb for the Four Toppers lists them as active from 1938 to 41. They have 4 actor credits in which they perform musical numbers, the same as they did in this film. And they have 2 soundtrack credits for which they also performed their musical numbers. And again, they released a number of single record discs. So no awards on these guys. In terms of performance, well, the reason that they're in this film is really 3 reasons. Good musical group. Yes, they were. I have not listened to any of their other stuff, but here they're definitely good. They're doing their own numbers. And it's all live. They're doing it all live. But what they're here for is to provide some music, first off, for what would have been an otherwise silent party. It's real weird when you watch this, and they're going to have a party for the newlyweds, and they all start dancing, but there's no music or anything. They don't even put on a phonograph record. It's weird. And then not long after that, the Four Toppers show up, and they're doing their musical numbers, so that was good. This was also there because they were a reasonably popular musical group with black people at the time. It gave this popular to black audiences band an opportunity to be seen, where ordinarily someone would have to go to a nightclub where they might be playing, or a stage show, or in a couple of cases they were, like acts inside of a movie. But this gave, the audience a chance to see them on the stage for the same price as going to see the movie. No radio or phonograph. Yeah, and that was weird because in 1940, of course, there was lots of radio. They could have turned on the radio to any number of stations and gotten some nice upbeat music to dance to. But again, that first part of the party before we cut back with the Four Toppers there, it's weird. It's just weird. They start dancing to nothing, and it's just strange. So the other reason they're there, frankly, is to add some runtime. I mean, if this film only tops out at 1 whole freaking hour, you need to pad the runtime somehow, and that was a decent way to pad it. It was at least organic. You could say, okay, these 4 guys were, guests at the wedding. Because we see a number of different people who guests at the wedding. I didn't look very hard. They might well have been in the one scene where they show the couple coming out of somebody's house that's supposed to be a church. And they might have been in there with them, I don't know. But you could certainly just say, hey, these guys were, part of the wedding goers, and they started doing their thing. Yes, getting on film does make them live forever, even when you got a crappy transfer. And all 3 of them that I looked at on YouTube were awful. And I looked at one also on the Internet Archive. That's actually where I pulled down one to get pictures of the cast, because the ones that were on YouTube were only like 240 p resolution, and the one on the Internet Archive was at least 480, so that's something. They don't look completely horrible and grainy when I'm putting them up here. But yeah, it does sort of make them live forever, as long as we keep prints of this. And hell, now that the thing is on 3 places on YouTube and 1 on the Internet Archive, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was 1 on BitChute. Yeah, it does sort of make them live forever. Their music, as much as we hear it here, and I think it's a couple of numbers, that's going to go on. We know that these guys existed. They were a real band. And to be honest, they are the least boring, aside from Nelson. They're the least boring thing in the film. The music numbers are upbeat, they're memorable, and as when the rest of the film is kind of dragging on and on and on, you kind of wish that maybe they'd found a way to just shove them in anywhere. The production here, the director and one of the producers is Richard C. Kahn. He lived from 1897. I keep saying 19 because I keep forgetting some of these people back in the ways. 1897 to 1960, died at the age of 63. His IMDb shows him as active from 1931 to 1958 with 15 directorial credits, which are largely Westerns, a lot of Westerns in his background, and some of them were Westerns starring black guys as, the Western hero. Some of his 15 director credits also overlap his writer and producer credits. He was, on occasion, all 3 of these at the same time. His has 5 writer credits, again, largely Westerns, and 6 producer credits, also largely Westerns, but it does include this one as well. His direction is flat, uncreative, and generally boring. There were, very few shots that weren't some kind of wide shot or a close-up, mostly a lot of wide shots, and it contributes to the lack of tension regarding the monster. Occasionally, there was one shot that I remember where the monster has been shot about 5 bajillion times, and it doesn't seem to be affecting his functionality in any way. But when he's walking up the stairs to the bedroom with the couple in it, they do have a shot showing his foot going up the stairs, and he's bleeding. And they have a shot later on of underneath the door where he's standing outside the couple's door, and you can see the blood on it. If the director had done a lot more of that, this would have been a much more interesting horror film. So there wasn't much of that. It was a lot of wide shots, occasional close-ups, and once in a while something like that with the monster, but not very frequently. Now, of course, this is a really low-budget film, clearly. And anytime you have a low-budget film, you're talking about a very rushed shooting schedule. You're talking about not having a lot of equipment. So if you're going to set up shots, that takes time. And, some of it you just have to say, well, low budget, rapid shooting schedule, not a lot of time to set up shots. But in any case, the direction here is certainly never in danger of winning any awards. The best you can say is you knew what you were supposed to look at. You could see what you were supposed to see. Pretty much the bad copies found everywhere make it hard. They've got lots of scratch marks on it. There are points at which the transfer made the film warp in places, so it looked like the background was rippling in odd places. It was not a very good transfer at all. But I don't think you're ever going to find anything better at this point. The producer was Alfred N. Sack. He was the guy who actually did the lion's share of the producing here. I didn't catch when he was born and died, but he was active in films from 1929 to 1968 with 15 producer credits, 19 presenter credits for something, so I'm not sure what all those were for. Probably it was points at which, you had films where you were doing variety sort of film, which they had. He was probably presenter for those sorts of films. Larry says lots of multitaskers, one person doing many jobs. Yeah, that's the thing on these low-budget films. Everybody does about 5 million things. You have no time to do it in, and you do the best that you can, but it's never going to win any Academy Awards. The thing about this is, I am absolutely sure that when your average black person at that time went to see a film with a black character, they were probably just going, oh, God, not again. Not another step and fetch it. Not another, yes, master, I'll do that for you, master. That's all right. Please, God, not another one of those. So they come to a movie like this, and okay, it may not be the greatest horror movie in the world, but at least you're seeing people that are realistic, that are like you are, There's very rarely, aside from this, and also with Native Americans in film, where you can just say, "Oh God, if you were one of those people back then, it must have been such a relief to walk into a movie like this and go, well, it ain't that great, but hey, at least I see a leading man who looks and acts like a leading man, even though he's black." So the second producer, Alfred and Sack, had a lot of credits and he has overlaps for both cast and crew of this film. He, knew these actors, he knew some of the crew, so he would keep hiring them over and over again. In terms of the production, his production company, Sack Amusements, was based in Dallas, Texas, and distributed and produced films that were called race films, which is what this were. As I say, I guess there was only one race back then, or two. But race films were produced just intended for black audiences because they were otherwise completely ignored by Hollywood. They didn't care about this audience at all. They didn't think there was any money in it. So Sack was impressed with Spencer Williams' screenplay. He wrote the screenplay based off of his story. And he offered him a chance to do both direct a feature film and to write one. And he wrote this one, oddly enough, didn't get the directing gig for it. He got the directing gig the year later with a film called The Blood of Jesus in 1941. But at that time, the only African-American filmmaker of any note was the self-financed Oscar Michaud. There were really no, aside from people doing these race films, and of those, Alfred Sack was one of them. There were really any other African Americans making films. Yeah, it was Jack Webb's Troupe of Players. Not quite, he had a lot of variation too. But if you look at it, oh, okay, yeah, he used this person in that film, and that film, and that film. He saw people that went, oh, okay. So there's a fair amount of overlap in his cast. Cinematographers are Roland Price and Herman Schopp. Roland Price, he lived 1893 to 1966, dying at the age of 72. His IMDb lists him as active 1921 to 1960. He had a very large gap from 1940 to 1952. In fact, right after Son of Ingagi, he kind of stopped working for over 10 years. He has 35 cinematographer credits, 1 director credit, and 1 writer credit. Herman Schopp, he was born in 1899, died in 1950 at the age of only 51. He had 11 cinematographer credits, 2 camera and electrical department credits, which means basically you're the guy running the camera. And he has 1 actor credit. In terms of his cinematography, the cinematography on this, well, I guess they got the shots that the director wanted. Probably the best you can say is that it's, such a low budget movie, and what the director probably wanted is what they got. You didn't have time to set up all these shots and do, interesting different things with it. It was a low budget movie. You can imagine it probably is something very similar. If you've seen the movie Ed Wood, about how, Ed Wood shot films, one take. He did guerrilla filmmaking where he didn't have permits to shoot somewhere outside. He would just shoot it in quick run. And he would, appropriate things from other studios. You could certainly imagine stuff like that happening here. Again, as with the director, you knew what you were supposed to look at, and you could see what you were supposed to see. And that's probably a big deal in a really low budget film like this. The music is either stock when we hear it, like the opening titles, and the only other time we hear music in here, opening and end titles, only other time we hear music is when they're doing one of those, stereotypical things where they've got the presses running for a newspaper, and then they suddenly bring up the title to you. And that's the only time we hear music. Otherwise, I think it's all just stock. The only other music that we hear is by the Four Toppers, and that's good music. So, yay for them. There is no production designer listed. I'm not too shocked about that. Somebody was doing something with the sets, but this was a low-budget film and only had 5 sets and 1 or maybe 2 location shoots. The sets were totally practical. They were interiors of then, what you would expect to see in a house of that era. In fact, I think they made an attempt with Dr. Jackson's house to make it look more like an upscale home. I don't know for sure about that, but when you know things like when you go back and you watch the 1940s Batman serials, right? Well, Batman's supposed to live in a mansion. But the expectations of what a mansion were back then were radically different than what they are now. The house that I'm currently living in belonged to my parents, and their homeowners association's agreement said that they could not have a black person, or in that case they called them Negroes, living in this home unless they were servants. Now, this home is a 3-bedroom house that you don't think of in terms of being very large today at all. But back then, this was a pretty damn good place. Of course, my parents, they checked first with their attorney to make sure that there was no way that they were going to be held responsible for that part of the homeowners agreement that dated back to the 1940s, because that's when this building was built. They wanted to check with their attorney to make sure that wasn't going to bite them, and the attorney said, oh, God, no, you could never enforce that today. What if they wanted to sell the house to a black person or something? So they had to make sure about that. A little comedy with the creature stealing the sandwiches. Yeah, that's where you got to see Spencer Williams doing his comedy. He went on to do Amos and Andy. He was a good comedian, and I think this was based off of probably a more serious, I couldn't find it, probably a more serious short story, but you needed to add something. And he was obviously good at physical comedy, which they had, in those scenes. It is one of the few things that's pretty good in film, just because we're relying on Spencer Williams' physical comedy. But on a budget like this, you're happy if the walls tend to stay upright when people open and close the doors. There's a point at which they're trying to break down this one door to the basement. It's a little harder than it should be to break it down, but you don't see the walls moving, So in a low budget like this, that's what you worry about. Everything is shot with, muslin walls that are, painted around. Muslin is put around this frame while it's wet. It then stretches out so that it's nice and rigid, and then you paint it to look like whatever you want to paint it like. So the fact that nothing bounced or moved when they went in and out of rooms, that was a good thing. The primary location shoot for this was intended to be a church, and they've got it intercut with other stock footage and close-ups and things of hands and stuff like that, and there's a couple kissing, that makes it appear to be a church. But when they actually do the location shoot and have them walking out the door, I would swear that they're just walking out of somebody's house. You don't see the house door, but I'd swear that was not a church. However, they still do it reasonably well. It works. You don't say to yourself, well, you don't necessarily go, oh, that's not a church. But I looked at it and went, that sort of looks like somebody's house next to their garage or something. There is no one credited for special effects, but the only real special effects in this were the house burning down. And I'm reasonably certain that was stock footage. There is no costume designer listed, but really the costumes. I always like to say, and this is for the benefit, you've heard it, Larry, and Super Cruise 63, but this is for the benefit of anyone who might be watching this on demand later on and be a different viewer, because I have reached 200 subs. That is a milestone for me. So somebody you may be watching this at some point, and I always say that clothes should tell you something about the person. If you saw me on the street today, I'd be wearing what was my t-shirt today? A Superman t-shirt again. Big red S, much larger one. Oh, crap. There goes my... Oh, well. I can't sew it on. Somewhere I was wearing a Superman T-shirt, not distressed. I always make sure that my Superman T-shirts are not distressed, so that the big red S looks like a real big red S, nice and bright on a blue T-shirt. So you would have seen me wearing that and a pair of jeans, and that would have told you something about me in terms of who I am. And in this, certainly, I always mention too that this is a costume. I am nobody that I know anywhere in what the coasts call flyover country. Nobody I've ever met wears this. This is just a costume. I'm attempting to project something of an image. And when you get other people, they will make choices about the clothes that they make, and that will tell you something about them as a person. And here we basically have that going on. They were more or less contemporary street clothes. The biggest difference being when the couple got married and you got to see a bridal gown. Interesting thing about that time period was that bridal gowns were not anything like what you expect them to be today. I believe that my mother said that her bridal gown was made by her sisters. That's what you expected. Nowadays we've got bridezillas who, go and spend $10,000 on a freaking dress. So what you saw there was a perfectly reasonable facsimile of a bridal gown. It wasn't crazy, but it was doing what it was supposed to be, a nice white bridal gown. And other times you see them there in sort of street clothes or clothes that you would expect someone of that era to be wearing. I think that they were probably either taken from the production company's inventory or purchased right off the rack and simply tailored to fit a given character. But nevertheless, they did work. They're notable here simply because they aren't the usual servants' clothes that you see in a lot of films in this era. They were upscale, they were attractive, as you would probably see these individuals if they were, worked in real life in their own real occupations. A doctor, a lawyer, a police officer, a detective, and they had all of those at one point or another. Again, the biggest thing here is not the fact that it's a horror movie, because it's not a very good horror movie. The biggest thing is how the black people who are in it are portrayed and how different that is from everything else that Hollywood was doing at that time. Makeup is uncredited, but of course the only real makeup of note here is Gina's monster makeup. Well, it is obviously a low-budget film with a low-budget creature to match it. If you're going for sort of a gorilla-human hybrid, which is what they were apparently doing, on a shoestring, it works, I guess, on a shoestring, and you're not, Again, for me, the best part of it was the lower part of the face. That looked reasonably like sort of... because they had, lips that stuck out a lot more like maybe an ape's lips. The rest of it, though, looked like they were gluing hair on a lot and a very long, shaggy wig. They put some makeup so there was hair on the hands that you could see before it went up sleeves and things like that. They did do some makeup in terms of having things like, when Gina got shot several times. That doesn't seem to bother him at all. Apparently, if you're a gorilla-human hybrid, man, is your stamina up there. You can get shot by all kinds of things and not have to worry. But they did do some of that. They did a little bit with the blood. Again, if they'd done some more of that kind of shooting where you can get in close up and see things, and it helps set the tension and bring the tension up. But again, low budget film. No shooting time probably, and you just don't have time to set up those shots very much. The fact that we got 2 or 3 of them is probably indicative that they were working pretty damn hard. So, at the end of a review, we ask ourselves, is it any good? Well, again, it is notable basically as the first African-American horror film and being part of a genre called race films that treated black people as actual human beings, as opposed to, step and fetch it, servants, slaves, stuff like that. It treats them as real human beings, and that's an important thing. As I say, as if I was a black person back then and I went to a regular movie and I saw a black character, and I go, oh God, here we go again. It's going to be yet another one of those. And you could walk into one of these race films like this one and say, okay, that's somebody that, like me, that I can actually identify with. A little bit of reality here. But beyond that, it is really a low-budget movie that is reasonably well acted. The direction is uninspired, and everything else is pretty much what you'd expect of a very low-budget movie. I would watch this for the historical value. You know, if you're watching it expecting a really good horror movie, you're going to be disappointed. It is good for the historical value, but that's really about it. It is otherwise. It was to me just, with a couple of exceptions like the Four Tops and Inspector Detective Nelson and his goofiness. It was just slow, really slow. I found the pace really slow. So, that is all I have to say about that for a review. Let me look at the time, 10:10. As I mentioned, I have reached 200 subscribers. Hopefully that hasn't changed. Hope nobody's dropped off. But I hit 200 subs a few days ago, so yeehaw! That is a milestone for me. It's not a gigantic milestone, but in the words of the Jeffersons, I am moving on up. I won't do the song because people will kill me. I potentially get in enough trouble by not calling people African Americans consistently. Hopefully nobody's upset that I use the word black. The Four Tops got their name from these four toppers. I don't know for sure. I did research because there were a number of different bands. There was the Four Toppers. There was another band called the Four Toppers. And then they became the Five Toppers. And then you had the Four Tops. And the websites I was reading on it were saying that it was a little difficult even for them to figure out whom was whom. The only way you could tell which Four Toppers you were dealing with at one point was by what their numbers were, and if you were seeing them either live or on film someplace, or listening to their records. But looking back at it from early 21st century. Even the websites I was looking at were getting it confusing. I felt lucky that I was able to get the picture of the right ones rather than the wrong ones. So I don't know for sure where the names come from. It gets hairy in there in terms of where the names came from and who did what. But again, 200 subs, yay for me. I didn't bother to bring down my Everclear, which I think I did the last time when I did 100 subs, but. 200 subs. So I'm moving. I'm getting up there. I think it's because of some of the reviews I'm doing. It's odd. Again, I don't do these outrage reviews, so I don't see the same kind of views. I am doing Batwoman every week. I'm so glad when something like this last Sunday happens and there was unexpectedly, I didn't know, I thought they were going into the next episode. Unexpectedly, there was a rerun. And I'm like, oh, yes. If you watch my Facebook, I put up a picture of John Barry, I think it's John Barry, who played Rerun in the TV series What's Happening. And I said, thank God for reruns. Now I don't have to watch this crap. Because Batwoman really is turning into modern Plan 9 from outer space. Larry says 200 subs. Congratulations. Thank you very much. So I'm doing that one. It's the only one right now I'm consistently doing because we just ended the series season 4 Doctor Who. Did a fairly lengthy review on that. Liked that one a lot. I'm no longer doing Star Trek at all in any incarnation because for the last 11 years I have been burned. And I now believe that for the current idiots running these shows, Star Trek is no longer Star Trek. And I put a link to that video where I talk about it. And I also put a link to Gene Roddenberry when he talks about the Star Trek philosophy, which I also uploaded. I think if you watch those two, you can see why it's no longer Star Trek. And it has been 11 years in the making. After 53 years with that franchise, I'm calling it quits. We're not going to get real good Star Trek anymore. We're going to see something nihilistic and horrible where you can pull an eyeball out of someone's socket without any anesthesia, showing the audience every last gory detail. And that ain't Star Trek anymore. Larry says, Doctor Who's getting destroyed. They have not had good stories. All of the season 11 last year, just unmemorable. I can tell you some of the basic plot stuff on a couple of them, But for the most part, they're just forgettable. I mean, they're social justice warrior cramming a message down your throat that makes Star Trek's Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, which is the one with the half black, half white guys that were different on either side and they hated each other because of that. It makes that episode look subtle. If you're making Let That Be Your Last Battlefield look subtle, then you are one serious social justice warrior crazy dude. And they've had a lot of those episodes. Now, the one that was in yesterday's episode, I find that I am on an extreme minority who seems to like that. Now, of course, we have all of the usual suspects, the ones who are, the outrage acting reviewers who will just be outraged and there's nothing you can do about that. But I've also now had some feedback on that review, and, Doctor Who fans of long times think that episode wasn't any good. I thought that it was probably the first decent episode they'd done. There were some that were better than the ones they'd done last year, but that one I thought was really very good. Thank goodness we have 28 seasons of real Star Trek and 11 movies, not counting the JJ-verse. Yes. For me, as I say, dropping out of this franchise has been a difficult thing because for the last 11 years, since 2009, I have been watching either generic action schlock or something that just isn't Star Trek, like Picard and Discovery now. They just aren't what Star Trek is intended to be. And I get a lot of pushback from younger fans who say, oh, yeah, you have to change it. You have to change it this way. And I'm like, there's ways you can change it that don't totally betray the principles. And it totally betrays the principles. I mean, you could do these season-long, 10-episode arcs if you want to. That's something you could do, although I don't think that's going to age well. When you look historically, you find that the 4-act dramatic structure is the one that ages well. We've been using it since at least the ancient Greeks, and it has always aged well. These ones that are, 10 episodes where you don't get a real climax until the very end have not aged well. Look at the serials of the 1930s. They really have more in common with those. So, but I mean, if you wanted to do, Star Trek using that, you could. It's just that you can't do stuff like, Discovery and Picard have been doing that's just nihilism and horror. The nihilism is not a part of Star Trek. It should never be a part of Star Trek. Earth is, in fact, a utopian society in the 24th century, period, end of story. And you can't portray somebody as living in a trailer house out in the middle of nowhere when you have replicator technology. Replicator technology means nobody's poor anymore. Oh, sure, she can go ahead and be a deadbeat mom and, take drugs if she wanted to. That's certainly a possibility. You could replicate all the drugs you wanted. Replicate morphine if you want to. But you certainly couldn't be poor. It wouldn't really be possible. So retconning stuff into that just doesn't work. And Supercrew63 says Seth MacFarlane is keeping Trek alive with the Orville. Yeah, the Orville is the new Star Trek. Long may it air. If I had the money to spend, I really would at this point probably buy, I may have to think about doing it, getting a subscription to Hulu, just because I want to support that show. I pay zilch when I have watched any of Discovery and Picard, and I'm now glad that I never paid a dime one. To be perfectly honest, if you want to watch those shows, I outright advocate piracy. I will help you do it. Just ask. I may do an entire episode that is generally related to, in a roundabout way, how one might do piracy on the internet if one were interested in doing so. I will not make it specific to any show. It might be just a look at what's out there. Look at how people are pirating. Isn't that amazing? I may do something like that. So, we'll see. But if you're going to watch it, pirate it. They just suck. They just suck. And of course, next season, I've got a meme out there that shows that they had CBS apparently released some preliminary artwork for Star Trek Discovery, and I have put underneath it as my marketing meme Star Trek Andromeda. because if you know Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, the premise is very, very simple. Similar, rather. I'm sure the execution will be different, but the premise is very, very simple. Hulu starts at $5.99 per month. Yeah, as I say, at this point in the game, I have enough money that I can actually cost justify that. I can't cost justify like 15 different services, but Hulu I might be able to cost justify, and so I may get that. Do I think the same site will air Orville that does Discovery? The sites that I go to watch stuff when I'm not pulling it down with BitTorrent, and I only pull them down for BitTorrent if for some reason I really want to see it in high res. But the sites that I watch have all kinds of TV series on it. They have TV series that date back to the 1950s. And it's not that they are streaming them themselves. What I go to are what are called aggregator sites. Somebody will upload an episode of something way out there in the internet somewhere. And what these sites do is constantly just search the internet to see what new has come up. And usually with like Doctor Who, the Orville, Picard, they come up within 2 or 3 hours of it having actually dropped. When you get to something that's streaming like that, I don't know who they think they're fooling, because it shows up on BitTorrent within minutes of it having been dropped. I mean, people just grab this thing as a file as it drops, because if you know what I do, you can do that, and then they put it on BitTorrent. It's what I usually do is I always watch everything I'm going to review twice, and so what I'll do is, if I'm watching it live, which doesn't happen very often because they're streaming, but like I watch Batwoman live on the CW. And then shortly after it airs, I pull down a 1080p copy of it just so that I can watch it the second time. I know that in that case I could, because I have Spectrum, I could watch it a second time on demand. But the problem with Batwoman is it's shot in such darkness that I need it on my VLC media player so that I can kick the brightness on it up by about 20%, just so that I can have some chance of actually following the action. And even then, the stunts are often so poorly choreographed that you can't follow anything anyway. Hope NBC Seth won't affect the Orville. Yeah, I hope that going to Hulu and a streaming service still keeps it on the keeps it streaming. Can't say on the air anymore, but still keeps it alive. I was nicer when it was on Fox, but what can you say? The NBC Seth deal, I'm not entirely certain. I know that there's been rumors that Seth MacFarlane and NBC were in talks to buy the Star Trek franchise. I can't see how that would work. It's I think that they're propping up the Star Trek series on CBS All Access artificially to use it as the anchor for their entire streaming service. But I think they're propping those up artificially. The reason I think that is because they don't share the numbers. They don't tell you how many people are actually watching this freaking show. And to me, if I had a real hit on my hand with lots and lots of people watching, I would be crowing about that. I'd be saying, look at this, bajillions of people are watching this. And we're getting all of these new subscribers just to watch Star Trek because look at how big it is. But they don't do that. I have the sneaking suspicion that they are artificially keeping those numbers up and not telling the advertisers and just overselling it because they don't want to show that really nobody's watching. I don't know. It's always very hard to tell how many people are actually watching something like this versus aren't. Who the hell knows? And CBS ain't telling us. So. But I am going to be, because I no longer have Star Trek on the schedule ever, at all, period, end of story. Any new Star Trek comes out, I have not watched Picard since episode 5, because that's where they crossed the line for me. And I'm not going to watch it again. I'm not going to be watching Discovery. I will not be watching. I'm not even going to take the time to watch it. I will not be watching. If they come out with new movies, they're going to have to win me over. The movies have been the least offensive of it all. But they're going to have to win me over. I am not going to go see it. And if they actually do one that's directed by Quentin Tarantino, that I find outright offensive. Quentin Tarantino is an apologist for rapist and director Roman Polanski. There is somewhere, you can find it if you search for Howard Stern, Polanski, and Tarantino. He just outright goes and says that this 13-year-old girl that Roman Polanski had drugged, boozed up, and then started sexually abusing. He said, well, she's a party girl. She kind of expected that. It wasn't really rape. Like 13 years old, boozed up and drugged. If I did that, going to jail, period, end of story. And so would Polanski if he hadn't fled the country. And the guy still gets all kinds of awards. And people like Quentin Tarantino who are saying that he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And, apologizing for his rape and saying it's not really and blaming the victim. And I'm like, no. If you make a Star Trek movie with Quentin Tarantino, I'm going to actively work to see that thing gets nothing but, hopefully I can get people to not watch it at all. And if I can't do that, I'm going to pirate the frack out of it. I will be a permaseater for any resolution of that movie. I will be permaseating for when it comes out, because somebody will do it within 24 hours as a cam. I will permaseat it when it comes and released on a Blu-ray. I will not do anything that's going to give money to Quentin Tarantino. I will never do that again. And I will work to undercut his income wherever possible. I think Super Cruise 63 says, I think the Axanar fan films would have made a great series. Bummer, we will never get to see it. Yeah, there are a lot of things that fans... I'm going to be reviewing a lot more fan films. I'm going to be reviewing a lot more classic science fiction now that I kind of had this open space in my schedule, because without doing any Star Trek and no more Doctor Who and... well, there's Batwoman. But aside from that, and I tell you honestly, the only reason I'm doing Batwoman is because the outrage reviewers tend to get a lot of views. And while I don't get outraged, there is nothing good to say about that show. It is all Plan 9 from outer space level stupidity. So I'm going to have a lot more space open, and I'm going to start reviewing fan films as part of it, because it's going to be my saying, this is what Star Trek really looks like. You have fans, they get it. They understand what Star Trek is at its core about. And it doesn't have to be, serialized, one and done episodes. It can be something else. Most of them are, because they're essentially mimicking what original series and Next Gen did in terms of their story structure. But the fans get it. The people who are running the madhouse now do not. I don't care, because I know Michael Chabon, who is a showrunner on Picard, says, oh, I'm a huge Star Trek fan. And I'm like, yeah, okay, you may have watched the show, but you missed the point entirely. And so I'm going to be saying, watch the fan films, even the ones that are coming out now that are fairly short because of the CBS rules. But I'm going to be watching and reviewing those more, a lot more, now that I have the open spaces in my schedule for it. Certainly be reviewing The Orville when it comes back. Next time The Expanse goes into a new season, I'll probably review that. There'll be some movies coming up that I'll be reviewing, new science fiction movies and a few superhero movies. Although, I have to tell you, I wonder where they're going to go with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think that they should have just ended that at Endgame. For me, there isn't a hell of a lot anywhere else to go. You have to build up to some other giant bad guy. I guess they could, now that they have the property back, I don't know, do they have the Fantastic Four back? I've forgotten now. They've got, X-Men back. There's certainly places you could go with X-Men in terms of a real big bad guy. You could go with somebody like Galactus if they have the Fantastic Four rights back. And you could introduce other supervillains like, Doctor Doom and people like that. But if you were looking at what was the natural, logical, dramatic closure point, it was at the end of Avengers Endgame. And I'm not sure they'll ever top that again. I think from here on out, we're just making movies until there are no more butts in the seats. And that's kind of too bad. But I'll be reviewing stuff like that. Hopefully there are no more Star Wars movies to review for any particular length of time. Might do into reviewing some of the Mandalorian when that comes back. The Mandalorian's first season was really very good. Very curious. Will they ever tell us what the race of Baby Yoda actually is? Will we ever find that out? It'd be nice to know, just as a fan. We finally have a name to put on that race. And will Baby Yoda be able to grow up and speak normal English? Or normal English will it speak? Who knows? But I will be doing a lot more fan films. I'll be doing a lot more of classic science fiction. I have a huge number this year because I'm doing it on the zeros. You know, I'm doing 1900, 1910, 20, 30, 40, 50 as usual. And it turns out, and my cutoff point is usually 1980, and it turns out that, man, were there a lot of science fiction movies that came out on the zeros. Particularly 1980, post Star Wars. Holy crap, all the stuff that was coming out. Turns out that I even get to Superman 2 on that one because it came out at the very tail end of the year and was released overseas, but it still counts, so I get to review that one. There's a lot of science fiction that came out after 77 in Star Wars. And 1980 was a big year for that. And it was also a big year just going back in time. There were a lot of stuff on the zeros, so I'll be doing a lot of those. So, I guess, barring anything else, that's probably all I have to say about that. I would, of course, love to keep the conversation going. So please leave your comments, questions, and nasty remarks. I'll do my best to respond to you. So my next scheduled review is going to be Batwoman. I may do something in between, but that'll be my next scheduled one. SuperCrew63 says The Mandalorian was pretty darn good, and I'm glad they decided to keep it going. Yeah. The mainline Star Wars movies have sucked, but they've got it right with Mandalorian. They've also got a number of different animated shows on the air. I've seen bits and pieces of them. They're not bad at all. I might go to review some of those. I'm not sure. It depends. Conceivably, depending on what I decide to review, I could have a very, very busy schedule in 2020 because you get stuff like there is actually a Nazi Germany era science fiction movie out there. I have yet to find it, but if I do, I'm going to be really interested. This would be a movie that was made under the auspices of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda. What does that look like? I'd be very curious to see what that would look like. So, but that is generally what I'm going to be doing this year. And again, love to keep the conversation going. So, thanks for watching. That is all the time that we have today for this episode of Tales from SYL Ranch, where everyone is entitled to my opinion. And I'm Bill Stone.
Ultimate power in this world has always been one simple thing: the control and manipulation of minds.